Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Leading Change. My name is Ema Roloff, and I've got Sara with me today. And we're going to be talking about taking a lean approach to continuous improvement across the entire organization. But before I get to all the questions that I've got for you, Sara, can you give everybody an introduction?
Sure. My name is Sara Hanks. I am a mother and a wife, and I'm a cook, and I love the outdoors. But if you were to ask me about my work experience and my background and what I do, I would say that my career has really been defined in five phases. I worked in engineering as a Six Sigma black belt for about 5 years, and I moved into manufacturing where I was a quality engineer and I ran a department. And then I moved into digital transformation where we focused primarily on quality and even extending that like into the supply chain. And then I went through a phase of focusing on data analytics. And part of my team was a group of data scientists who were building machine learning models. And then recently, it's been a mode of putting it all together and working in this role of continuous improvement, where my team will be put on these complex cross-functional problems and we'll work using all the skill set and experience that we have to solve those issues.
I love that you started it with a mom, a wife, and a cook because I cannot take that cook designation in our house. I'm not the one that I'm a baker, not a cooker. So if I had to,
I'm the opposite. I'll do the cooking. I'm not a baker.
I'm the rule follower and like the directional follower in our house. So I'm good at taking the recipe and doing exactly what it says. But when it's like a little bit of this and a little bit of that, I fail miserably and it never comes out the way I want it to. Thank you so much for joining us today, Sara. And I guess to get started, so I teased the idea that we're going to be talking about this concept of lean principles. You mentioned that you've got that manufacturing background. Can you get us started by talking about how you can take that idea of lean manufacturing and apply it to business processes and what that looks like from a optimization standpoint?
Yeah, sure. I'm glad you mentioned the word principles because that's really where it starts. And there's five basic principles when it comes to lean. And I think those principles in by themselves actually lend themselves to what I would call the lean office as well. The first one starts with value, and that is identifying what your customers are willing to pay for. So whether you're building product that's physical or whether you're providing a service or whether you're providing some sort of financial something or an insurance policy, for example, if it's something that the customer is willing to transact money in exchange for, that is identified as value. And then from there, it's really about what are the steps required to produce that value. And that starts all the way at the very front end of your business process, from acquiring customers all the way through the final transaction to the point where the customers are satisfied. And even beyond that, because you would want to extend it into what happens if the customer does return back to you for some reason or another to address an issue. And then it's about establishing flow through that value stream, which is making sure that there's no bottlenecks in your processes, making sure that there aren't any interruptions or distractions, and that things move. When I say things, I specifically mean like information and material, whatever that looks like in your business, as it moves from one step to the next through the process. You want to establish what we call flow, which is that seamless movement from one step to another. The fourth principle is what we call pull. And that essentially is when the customer is ready to accept an order, that pulls the organization through to be able to provide it. And what would be the opposite of that would be what we call push, which is I'm going to produce a bunch of things and let them pile up. And when a customer is willing or ready to take an order or transact money for a service, there's a whole stockpile of things that are available to choose from. And the challenge with that type of approach is it ends up costing businesses a lot of money. And so by waiting for the demand to be present from the customer to put the energy into creating it, you actually are doing more of an optimized business process from a financial standpoint. And then the last one is really around mindset of continuous improvement. And that's being able to look at a process, identify waste within that process, and always seek to improve. And I think there's a lot of culture buried in that too, because it's expected that everybody can equally participate in continuous improvement effort. And each person within an organization becomes empowered, and they have the opportunity then to see the waste items within the process and then also try and take actions to do things to eliminate them and drive those efficiencies.
So when we talk about this idea of waste, it's really easy to conceptualize what that would look like on the manufacturing floor. But when we're taking these principles and we're applying them to business processes, what does that look like in that office environment?
So I could take an example of each waste item and explain what that could look like in an office environment. I think one of the most frustrating forms of waste for myself is really in wait. On a shop floor, you might be waiting for to deliver you material, or maybe you're waiting for a machine to get fixed. But in an office environment, if you're waiting for a response from somebody, or you need additional information in order to make a decision and take the next step, that is something that would be considered wasteful within an office environment. Another example is around what we would call overproduction, and what this could look like in an office environment. I don't know if you've been or seen like email that tends to go out to audiences that don't necessarily add value, but they still contribute to the conversation. So what you end up seeing is this pile-on effect of people responding to email and it triggering a whole bunch of other conversation that's happening in email. And maybe that whole lengthy chain could have been avoided with a meeting, as an example. Or if you're more thoughtful about who are you sending the message to, and is it clear who is expected to respond, you might be able to save a whole bunch of inboxes and a whole bunch of people's time from having to read this whole string of conversation. I think another place that waste really gets buried, what we would call in a lean sense, motion. And motion is when people have to take action. And so where this shows up in an office environment is if you have to hunt and peck to find files, or maybe you're collaborating with a bunch of people and there's information that is shared across, but it's not in an accessible way, and you're taking time to look for things, that's an identifier of waste in an office environment. And then on the flip side, you've got transportation, which is really about, like in a digital sense, if you're fetching data or information from multiple sources. So if you're constantly having to swivel chair to take an action on a step and move from system to system, that would be considered wasteful. And I could go through a few more examples, but I think the biggest challenge in an office environment or an office setting isn't always just the waste associated with these specific things. Maybe it only takes 2 minutes to find a file, but the problem is within that 2 minutes, there's a really good possibility that you receive an interruption and you hadn't completed that task yet. And that is, in fact, one of the biggest waste items, is that need to stop and do something else that's unrelated, and then having to come back to it, because it requires, one, that you remember that you needed to go back to that in the first place, and two, our brains take a while to get back to where we were before. And so that takes a certain amount of time to ramp back up. And that also adds to the waste. So while in reality, it could only mean 2 minutes of searching, you pair that with an interruption, and now you could be talking days or even weeks of adding cycle to creating your business process because of that interruption.
Those use case, I live that life often, not necessarily by anybody else's issue, but more like my inability to stay focused on one task for a long period of time. Switching back and forth and then remembering, oh, I got to go back and finish that. And we certainly are aware that stuff is happening in our business processes, but when you take a step back and you look at it from like this macro level of how the process is flowing and where you have these breakdowns in your cycle time, it adds up and it can become really impactful. So, to the point of bringing forward some of that experience on the digital transformation and machine learning side of things, how do we use technology to remove these areas of waste within our process and really start to do more with less, so to speak?
So I think it starts with digitizing processes. If an office process is dependent upon people exchanging emails, work getting done in spreadsheets, and things living in systems that are disconnected, an easy way to drive a lean transformation in an office environment is to move that into some sort of application. If it's customer facing, maybe that's a CRM or a customer relationship management system. If it's internally, maybe there's some financial tracking system that would be involved. And I think the benefit that you get through just digitization alone is the ability to collect data on those timestamps. And you can identify how long it takes to get through a specific step, which is great for driving continuous improvement because now you have data to focus on and prioritize to understand what are the bottlenecks and the waste associated with the process to make that happen. If you're putting in a system fresh, I wouldn't recommend taking your current state process though and simply digitizing it. I would go through the exercise of identifying what your future state wants to look like and then work towards an implementation of a system or a group of systems that will get you towards that future state. But it doesn't have to stop there. I think looking at, in some cases, there's duplicate data entry or repetitive tasks. And I think in those cases, looking at a robotic process automation option could be a solution in that space. You will invest a little bit up front in the robotic process automation technology, but you may find that you're saving a lot more on the backside in terms of people's time being spent doing non-value add things. Whereas if you take that work off their plate, they're able to do a lot more that will be valuable for your business and your customers. I think another place is, and I've seen this, we've done this in multiple projects, is using machine learning on the data for identifying where there could be risk. And when we talk about like business efficiencies, we don't tend to think about risk because it's hard to identify where in the financial statements that shows up. But the problem is when a risk becomes an issue and now you're dealing with a real-time crisis, it's inevitably going to be expensive. So if you can get your business to think about what could happen through risks, I think machine learning is a great way to be able to create some sort of risk score and alert people to maybe dig in a little deeper to take action before it becomes a catastrophic issue. I think another example is augmented reality. In the event that there needs to be collaboration across teams in different locations, or if the customer site is different from the specific location. And I think augmented reality is a great way to be able to drive that collaboration, and you can end up saving time and cycle time in doing so. My experience with that has been primarily within the manufacturing and the physical environment. But I would think in some other cases that might be an option as well, just for some examples. Oh, and then the last one is conversational AI. If you need to get answers quickly, or you want to be able to provide your customers with answers quickly, looking into conversational AI and chatbots is another way to help improve delivery of customer value.
I actually just made, before I joined you, made a comment on someone's post about GPT, or they were talking specifically about GPT-4, the possibilities. And I said, one of the biggest use cases that I see is probably not as sexy as many of the others, but it's doing things like improving accuracy and efficiency of things like chatbots and giving your internal team access to information so that we're not hunting and pecking and trying to find information that's buried somewhere.
Yes.
Exciting as many other people would like to see. Jobs are going to be eliminated, but actual use cases where we're able to improve people's lives. And so it's funny that you brought that up. I thought, I had a feeling it might come up in the conversation.
The more I play around with ChatGPT, the more I recognize that it really is a compliment to myself and the work that I do. Because if I am struggling with trying to get thoughts to paper specifically, just asking a question like, help me think about shaping this, and I get really great feedback. And even if I don't use it exactly, it's a lot easier to edit a draft than it is to create a draft.
Yeah. And I think that the other part that people aren't necessarily giving enough attention to is that for these tools at this point where they are maturity wise, you have to be really good at doing that question asking. And you have to be really good at giving it context of exactly what you're looking for it to be able to recreate what you or I might be able to in that context. And so that skill of question asking and being inquisitive and thoughtful of what you're looking for is still a really important part of the process that I think we're undercutting when we use these sweeping statements of replace versus augmentation. But thank you so much for joining me, Sarah. I'm sure we could keep going on for a while about this, and maybe we'll find another time to chat. But for anybody that's not already, make sure you make your way over to Sarah's LinkedIn, give her a follow, join in on the conversations that we're having back and forth on LinkedIn pretty regularly. And thank you everybody for tuning in, and have a wonderful day. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Leading Change. If you liked what you saw, be sure to subscribe and come back weekly for more expert interviews on digital transformation, change management, and emerging technologies.